How can you be the head of one of the biggest drug trafficking networks in history, run away with the equivalent of over $100 million in today's money, and disappear without a trace? I think only Frank Matthews holds that secret. Ranked by the DEA as one of the top 10 drug traffickers in U.S. history, Frank Matthews has had an incredible story, yet few people talk about it. Based in Brooklyn in the 60s and 70s, this young African-American gangster, in his 20s at the time, was indeed at the head of one of the greatest criminal empires this world has ever known. His fortune was estimated at $300 million, the equivalent of $2 billion today. A colossal fortune acquired through the sale of heroin and cocaine throughout the eastern United States, a network that was totally independent of mafia control, which was extremely rare for an African-American gangster, and I'd like to say for an American gangster at all. By freeing himself from the mafia, Frank Matthews had done better than his predecessor, Bumpy Johnson, but also better in terms of fortune than Frank Lucas, the heroin dealer popularized by the film American Gangster. But then again, few people seem to know about this. No doubt Hollywood didn't want to popularize a criminal who had managed to beat the system. Because can you imagine a gangster movie with the thug running off with the money at the end? Because that's exactly what Frank Matthews did, even though he was supposed to appear in court. Disappearing from the face of the earth just like that, with his girlfriend and over $100 million in his pocket. A completely surreal and enigmatic end to a criminal career. In short, a mysterious gangster who certainly deserves to have his story told. So, get ready to dive into the most intriguing unsolved case of recent decades.
And he had been identified as one of the largest, if not the largest, heroin trafficker in the United States.
He was in a league of his own, and he was a top, not only an organizer, but a businessman. There's been a lot of recent movies on Lucas being the king of drugs. That's not true. And Matthews was the #1 heroin pioneer.
I'd say he was definitely smarter than Frank, okay? Frank Lucas, yeah.
Where he is today, God only knows.
I think he's alive. And I say this unequivocally because he's a smart person.
All of the agents who work on the case to this day believe he's still alive.
The life of Frank Matthews is, how can I put this, one hell of a mystery. But what's even more of a mystery is his youth, about which we really know very little. The reason? The many conflicting accounts from people who supposedly knew him. Ricky Johnson, a native of Durham, the North Carolina town from which Frank Matthews came, tells us,
"You hear so many stories about Frank Matthews. It's hard to distinguish what's what. They all have a different version of growing up with him. You realize a lot of what you hear is really just rumor."
Another Durham resident agrees.
"A lot of people like to make up stories so they can be in the limelight. They say they remember Frank sold drugs for him, but then you realize they are younger than Matthews and not from the same generation. They just want to be a part of the legend."
As for those who really knew him, well, they generally avoid talking about it. As this Durham native, who claims to have known Frank, puts it,
"You ain't gonna get people from here to open up about Frank. They're either thinking you with the law, or they fear they may say something that can come back and bite them. People here are cautious. Many think Frank Matthews is still alive. You never know who's listening, or what may get back to him."
So, it's not easy to get a clear picture of Frank's youth. But there are a few things we can learn about his early years. Frank Larry Matthews hails from Durham, North Carolina. He was born there on February 13, 1944, into a family he hardly knew. We know nothing about his father. As for his mother, she died when he was barely 4 years old. From then on, young Matthews was raised by his aunt, who took him in and raised him as her own son. He lived in the poorest district of Durham, a city renowned at the time for being home to one of the most prosperous black communities in the country, despite the segregation in force. A Durham native and friend of Matthews recalls,
The Rand and segregation days had everything a black person could want. We had a lot of black wealth per capita. We had more black millionaires than any city in North Carolina. The atmosphere of this period gave young blacks the incentive to try to achieve more.
which I'm sure Frank was, inspired without a doubt by all the successful black entrepreneurs in Durham. Al Bradley, an author who has written extensively on Frank's life, will say,
Matthews must have seen lots of black-owned businesses and successful black men when he was growing up. That later gave him the chutzpah to circumvent the Italian mafia in the drug business. That was unheard of at the time. Something in Matthews growing up gave him the confidence to stride fearlessly into a world that didn't respect him.
Frank made his mark from an early age, especially with his classmates and the boys in his neighborhood. He seems to be a born leader, whom children of his age want to follow. People who knew him as a child used the same two words to describe him: strong and charismatic. Qualities that would later enable Frank to compete with New York's most ruthless gangsters. At school, however, the picture is not the same. Frank lacks seriousness and seems disinterested in his schooling. What he prefers is to be on the streets, an environment in which he's like a fish in water. No wonder he dropped out of school at an early age. All he wanted to do was make money, as one of his childhood friends recalls.
Even in those days, he was all about money. Frank was a hustler.
Frank Matthews could also be generous to his loved ones. On the other hand, you didn't want to mess with him because he could also turn violent, as another of his comrades points out.
Frank was a natural who would fight anybody over anything.
He could, however, be aloof and reserved, as this other friend reveals.
People bragged that they knew Frank, but they didn't really know him. You can never really get close to Frank.
As a teenager, he became the leader of a gang in which he was involved in several petty crimes, including the theft of chickens from a local farm, which led to his arrest at the age of 14. He later joined a hairdressing school, but only stayed there a few months. According to a Durham native, this was because Frank had been caught stealing barber's equipment. But the latter also adds,
Not too long after that, I saw Matthews on Fayetteville Street. He said he was going to New York to make money.
Frank left his hometown of Durham in the early 60s to seek his fortune. Still in his teens, he set off to pursue his dreams of fortune by heading northeast, initially for Philadelphia. He stayed there for about a year. During this time, he worked as a barber and number collector for a numbers game racket. Through this illegal activity, which was widespread at the time, Frank met other ambitious young people who, like him, were looking to make money. But, as mentioned, Frank didn't stay long in Philadelphia, and in 1963, or perhaps 1964, he left for New York. A logical choice for Roger Garay, a police detective who had investigated him.
New York is a city of opportunity for an ambitious gangster, as well as for those who want to make an honest living.
Frank moved to Brooklyn and continued to do what he had been doing in Philadelphia, working as a hairdresser while organizing illegal gambling. He continued this activity for some time before tiring of the numbers game racket and turning to a more profitable business: drug dealing. Frank was quick to see that the black drug dealers in his neighborhood were lining their pockets, so it didn't take long for him to decide to follow, as Inspector Roger Garay points out.
I think Frank woke up one morning and decided to hang up the barber's white jacket. Frank said to himself, I'm going to be the dude who wears the $300 silk suits and drives the Lincoln.
In the 60s and 70s, an illicit substance spread massively in New York: heroin. At the time, the drug was creating a veritable epidemic, fueling violence and disorder in the black community, a chaos that one of the city's former police officers remembers.
The year after King's assassination, we had more than 2,000 homicides in New York. The majority of them were in Harlem, and I'd say about 85% of them were drug-related. It got so bad that if a cop working in Harlem gave someone a summons for double parking, it could easily have led to a small-scale riot. That's how close to the edge Harlem was in the late 1960s. Drug dealers like Frank Matthews and Nicky Barnes became heroes because people looked upon them as defying a system that didn't work.
Frank took advantage of the situation, and in order to get involved in the flourishing drug trade, he had no choice but to make contact with a criminal organization that controlled the supply and distribution of heroin throughout New York, the Great Cosa Nostra. In the 1960s, the drug trade on the U.S. East Coast, and particularly in black communities, was controlled by New York's 5 major mafia families: the Gambinos, the Lucchese's, the Bonanos, the Genoveses, formerly Luciano, and the Colombos, formerly Profaci. For a time, the trade was dominated by Jewish gangsters, notably Arnold Rothstein, an organized crime figure who, as early as the 1920s, had grasped the lucrative potential of this illegal trade, helping to organize and expand it in Uncle Sam's country. Then, in the 1930s, the Italian mafia, seeking to diversify after Prohibition, joined the Jewish underworld in drug trafficking before monopolizing the market in the following decade. After the Second World War, heroin, which the mafia trafficked, was imported from Italian refineries. These refineries closed after the Italian government decided to ban heroin manufacture in the early 50s. Left with no choice, the mafia looked for other sources of supply. And it was here that the French Connection was born, with the establishment of an even more sophisticated smuggling network in which opium was cultivated in Turkey, then sent to France for processing in clandestine laboratories, and finally distributed throughout the United States. This network, which thrived in the 50s and 60s, enabled the American mafia to continue trafficking drugs in the United States and New York. To penetrate this market and start selling his first kilos of heroin, Frank Matthews had to go through the Cosa Nostra. He did this by trying to form a partnership with the Gambino and Bonanno families, but for one reason or another, they turned him down. Many would have been discouraged by this refusal, but not Frank. He was young, ambitious, and determined to make his mark in the dope business, so he persevered until he found another opportunity. An opportunity that came from Spanish Raymond Marquez, an acquaintance of Frank's known at the time as the king of the underground lottery in Harlem. He had connections, which he passed on to Frank, putting him in touch with a Cuban gangster by the name of Rolando Gonzalez Nunez, a major cocaine supplier who, in the 1960s, was one of the biggest coke dealers in New York, before fleeing to Venezuela because of legal problems. Frank gets in touch with Rolando and the deal is sealed. He buys his first kilo of cocaine for $20,000. The relationship quickly developed into a drug trafficking network. The Cuban drug trafficker regularly sent him large shipments of cocaine and heroin from South America, and Frank expanded his business by reselling the product in New York. And it didn't take him long to make his mark, becoming one of the city's biggest drug dealers in just 1 year. At the time, Venezuela was one of the Latin American countries where the Cosa Nostra was established. For drug traffickers, it was a strategic location, particularly thanks to its geographical proximity to the United States. An ideal base, which the French Connection used to transport its heroin to Latin America and distribute it to Miami, one of the main points of entry to the United States for drug trafficking. The Corsicans, with their ability to infiltrate and corrupt governments, were responsible for transporting the drugs to Venezuela. Then the Cubans would send the heroin to the United States before it was distributed throughout the country, including New York, where Frank, thanks to his collaboration with the French Connection and the Cubans, had become one of the city's biggest dealers. His network with the French Connection and the Cubans was paying off handsomely, although Frank knew he had to diversify. To do this, he set out to find new sources of supply and was prepared to do business with anyone as long as the product was pure enough.
Matthews was always willing to pay premium prices for multi-kilo shipments of pure heroin, if that was the best he could find.
In the end, Frank was just the opposite of La Cosa Nostra, who sold its drugs at exorbitant prices with no regard for the quality of the product. And so, it wasn't long before his network expanded even further, supplying drugs to nearly 21 different states, particularly on the East Coast of the United States. It never reached California, but in time, it certainly could have taken over the whole country, as U.S. Federal Prosecutor William Callahan reports.
If Matthews' wings hadn't been clipped as they were in 1972, he would have eventually dominated the national scene, and then he would have become a truly international kingpin. I think Matthews was so ambitious that could have been his ultimate goals.
Frank Matthews' profits from heroin and cocaine trafficking were staggering. It is said that he made up to $600,000 a day, and that his fortune was close to $300 million, the equivalent of $2 billion today, a fortune he amassed in the space of just 4 years. According to Liddy Jones, a former associate of Frank's, no gangster in New York at the time earned more money than him.
The Italian mafia made a lot of money, but they couldn't touch Frank. He had more money than the mob.
Liddy Jones then recounts this anecdote from the early 70s.
I had a good friend who said she knew somebody in Brooklyn who could give me all the smack I needed. My friend was tight with an associate of Frank. I asked for 5 keys and got it for $22,000 a key. I began making real good money from my connection to Frank Matthews. I learned I wasn't anything special. All the top drug dealers along the East Coast were getting their dope from Frank. It was amazing to make a deal with him. He never really counted the money. You could have shorted him thousands of dollars, and Frank wouldn't have known.
5 years after his arrival in New York, Frank Matthews had become the biggest drug baron in the city, even though he was barely in his 20s. He had created his own drug trafficking network, completely independent of the mafia, which was quite a feat for an African-American gangster. At the start of his criminal career, Frank Matthews was rather reserved in his lifestyle. He lived in a modest flat and didn't seem to do anything crazy, as Rick Talley, a former New York drug dealer who knew Frank in the late 60s, recalls.
In those days, Matthews did not really stick out in the crowd. In the way he was dressed, the way he talked, Frank looked and moved more like a country kid from North Carolina than a polished gangster.
However, as his drug empire grew, Frank began to take on a completely different role. He would dress in expensive clothes, cigar in mouth, and drive around in luxurious cars, showing off with beautiful women. He also traded in his modest flat for a mansion in the wealthy Toad Hill district of New York, a neighborhood that, at the time, was known for housing some of the city's most notorious mobsters, including Big Paul Castellano, the future godfather of the Gambino family, who had his home directly opposite Frank's mansion. There were also some members of the Lucchese family, and Frank was the only black man living there.
No black people lived there, and some of the most powerful mobsters were just a stone's throw away from Matthews' house. In the Matthews era, the only blacks you could see in Todd Hill were the hired help. Even today, blacks comprise just the 1% of Todd Hill's population.
Otherwise, Frank was a heavy cocaine user, if not a drug addict. Donald Goddard, an author who took an interest in his life, recounts,
By the autumn of 1972, Matthews showed the classic symptoms of chronic cocaine abuse, shuffling between extremes of euphoria and irritability. This helps explain Matthews' frequent irrational behavior in the way he handled drug deals.
William Callahan, the federal prosecutor who investigated the Matthew case, adds,
During the course of our investigation, we learned that he had a rapid, irregular heartbeat, so by abusing cocaine, Matthews was risking his health.
An addiction that didn't stop him from continuing to expand his empire and amass even more money.
It's amazing to see what he did as a self-made man and how he built a criminal empire on his own. I think the only people in organized crime history comparable to Matthews are Lucky Luciano and Pablo Escobar.
Frank can indeed be compared to Luciano and Escobar, in the sense that, like them, he was the organizer and master of ceremonies of summits between kingpins. One in Atlanta in October 1971, during which he invited the country's biggest African American and Hispanic drug traffickers with the aim of improving the distribution of heroin and cocaine. And the other in Las Vegas the following year, during the fight between Muhammad Ali and Jared Corey, a meeting where similar topics were discussed, such as the need to establish stronger independent relations with the Corsican and Cuban mafia in order to free themselves from the control of the Italian-American mafia. An American anti-drug agent recounts,
"When we began checking out the license plates and the intelligence on who was in attendance, we could see it was a meeting of the who's who of black organized crime. Matthews was the reason they came. At the time, he really was the country's biggest black kingpin."
It was then that the authorities began to take a closer interest in him. Las Vegas was a place where Frank Matthews often went. Like many drug dealers, he loved a city that had legalized gambling. Frank went there to gamble, to have a good time, but also to launder his money, as prosecutor William Callahan points out.
"We heard Frank would take duffel bags full of cash to a casino and give them to a cashier. The casino would take 15 to 18% for laundering his money."
The strange thing was that the authorities didn't even have him on their radar. Frank Matthews had illegally made his fortune and risen to the top of the underworld, and no one in the police force seemed to know about it.
In 1970, Matthews' name did not appear on any of the major criminal violators lists kept by the authorities. He was a non-entity.
In fact, it wasn't until shortly after the Las Vegas summit in 1972 that the police finally started tapping his phone. It was the investigative group known as Group 12 that took a serious look at his case. Its aim? To find a way to indict drug baron Frank Matthews. The investigators included William Callahan, whose role was to coordinate the investigation, and Gerard Miller, a DEA agent with 20 years' experience in organized crime. Group 12 had to gather all the evidence they could to prove that Matthews was involved in drug trafficking. Not an easy task, given that Frank's only criminal record was for stealing chickens. Besides, Gerard Miller couldn't understand how such an influential drug trafficker had managed to escape the vigilance of the police so far. And how could an African American in his 20s be involved in drug trafficking in almost 21 states of the country? It was a perplexing observation for the agents, including Miller, who said,
"I hate to say it, but Frank was ahead of us from the beginning."
The investigation was therefore not easy to carry out, especially as Group 12 was under a great deal of pressure from its hierarchy to obtain results. And a lack of resources made available to carry out the investigation didn't help matters. The agents only had 3 months to produce something significant, which was very little, especially to nail a gangster of Matthews' caliber. In reality, it would have taken several years of investigation to achieve a convincing result. But Gerard Miller and his colleagues did their best with the resources at their disposal. It was thanks to them that Frank Matthews' telephone calls began to be tapped in 1972. The U.S. anti-drugs authorities then lent their support to the case, followed by Interpol and the U.S. Tax Service, with whom Group 12 was working closely to pursue the drug baron. Together, they succeeded in locating and seizing assets belonging to Frank, including several real estate properties. The investigators then tried to tail his car whenever they could, but Frank was faster than them and always escaped, breaking every possible rule of the road. Frank was probably under the influence of cocaine during these chases. Or did he know in advance that he was being watched? Corruption was widespread in the NYPD at the time. Either way, it wasn't worth continuing for Gerard Miller, who tells us,
"It didn't really matter. We knew it was futile to follow him. He didn't seem to fear anything."
He once opened the boot of his car in broad daylight, took out kilos of drugs, and gave them to an individual in full view of everyone. As if Frank Matthews didn't give a damn about law enforcement surveillance. But it was only a matter of time before things turned in the investigators' favor. Early 70s. Frank Matthews' network continued to supply the United States with illegal substances and generate millions of dollars in revenue. Group 12's investigation progressed to the point where it caused the first damage to the drug baron's empire. It began with the arrest of several of his associates. The arrests followed one another over time, with tongues occasionally being loosened, giving Group 12 more and more evidence to flesh out their case. After a year's investigation, the authorities finally had solid evidence to bring down Frank Matthews. All that remained was to arrest him. The arrest took place at 11 a.m. on January 5, 1973. Frank was at Las Vegas International Airport with his girlfriend, flying to Los Angeles, when the authorities stopped him to handcuff him. Sometime later, they had obtained an arrest warrant for tax fraud and conspiracy to traffic drugs. Matthews had attempted, between April and September 72, to sell 18 kilograms of cocaine in Miami, with an estimated value of between $1 and $4.5 million. So, drug baron Frank Matthews was finally arrested. All that remained was to await his trial, scheduled for 7 months later. At the bail hearing, which took place the day after his arrest, Frank showed a certain arrogance towards William Callahan.
"We were literally face to face. He told us that we had nothing on him and that he would be out in no time."
He seemed confident, but was soon disillusioned when he heard the amount of bail set by the magistrate: $5 million, the highest bail in the history of the United States at the time. This amount had been set because of Frank Matthews' high risk of absconding and his large fortune. Bail was subsequently reduced to $2.5 million, Frank having agreed not to oppose his extradition to New York. Then it was reduced again to $325,000, a ridiculous sum for a drug lord of Matthews' stature, who, unsurprisingly, jumped at the chance to regain his freedom. Yes, Frank Matthews was now free before the judgment, a mistake that the American justice system would come to bitterly regret, since the young gangster was not going to wait long to make his move. Frank had regained his freedom and was once again at the head of his criminal organization. For the investigators, this made it difficult to keep an eye on him before the trial. Police Inspector Roger Garay testifies.
"We couldn't keep tabs on Matthews. We were stretched thin and simply didn't have the manpower to watch him 24/7. All we could do was hope and pray he would keep showing up in court."
Hope was all that police had, because in the end, there was nothing to stop Frank Matthews from taking his belongings and disappearing with all his fortune. It has to be said that he was facing a life sentence, and that, in any case, the heroin market was increasingly unstable because of the gradual dismantling of the French Connection. So, based on this observation, there was nothing to stop him taking off. And that's precisely what happened on July 2, 1973. When the accused Frank Larry Matthews never showed up for the trial that was to send him to prison. The drug baron had disappeared, declared fugitive the day after his trial. So, what had happened? Well, some sources claim that Frank bid farewell to friends and gave away part of his fortune before disappearing for good.
We heard Frank left New York with 55-gallon drums filled with money.
Reggie Collins, a drug dealer at the time, says he was one of the last friends Frank saw before he disappeared.
It was 4 a.m., and we were at Flaps on 119th Street. Frank said he was heading out of town and not coming back. I watched him drive off in a 1972 Ford Thunderbird, black body, white top. Never saw him again.
Frank Matthews is said to have fled, but not alone, it seems, as his mistress, Cheryl Denise Brown, is also nowhere to be found. She had disappeared at the same time as Matthews, which suggests that the two ran away together. The authorities also claim that Frank Matthews laundered up to $20 million to prepare his escape, most likely leaving the country. $20 million at the time is equivalent to more than $100 million today, so that's quite a lot of money. The DEA offered a $20,000 reward to anyone who could help capture him. This was the highest reward since the one offered for John Dillinger in 1931. The authorities put out thousands of wanted posters across the country, receiving numerous calls from people claiming to have seen the fugitive. Unfortunately, these leads went nowhere. But the hunt for Frank Matthews intensified, and the DEA searched the world for him, having no doubt that they would capture him one day. Glenn Chisholm, one of the investigators involved in the search, recounts,
"It was the biggest manhunt in DEA history, so I was excited to be a part of the team. But it was frustrating as well. It looked as if we had mountains of evidence, but as we moved forward, the leads seemed to vanish into thin air."
However, we have learned that thanks to Interpol, which is collaborating with the U.S. authorities on the case, Frank Matthews has been seen in Rome, Amsterdam, and other European cities. Perhaps Frank Matthews was in Europe? If the reports on him are to be believed, it's entirely possible, but it was also likely that he was in Africa, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Venezuela, Philadelphia, Chicago, rural North Carolina, or maybe even Hong Kong. Yeah, that's a lot of places. The problem is that there's hardly any useful information in the files or any real leads to locate him. There are, however, some locations that are more plausible than others, like the Bahamas, a place where the fugitive owned property, Paraguay, known at the time to be home to the largest number of fugitive criminals, or Algeria, the ideal country for a fugitive in the 1970s, given that relations between Algeria and the United States were not very good at the time, and there was no extradition treaty between the two nations. The investigators therefore hoped that he was not there, because it would have been, shall we say, virtually impossible to capture him. The investigation group in charge of finding Matthews received hundreds of leads from all over the world. It was as if Matthews could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Getting information out of interviewees was also very difficult, as Glenn Chisholm reports.
"During the entire time I was involved with the investigation, I never interviewed anybody who actually knew anything about Frank's whereabouts. They would say invariably that if they knew where Frank was, they would not tell us because Frank was generous with his money."
Strangely, no one seemed willing to give any information about Frank Matthews. The investigators therefore interviewed other people, such as Barbara Hinton, Matthews' former wife, with whom he had 3 children.
"We interviewed Barbara at her liquor store. The store was sparsely stocked, and it didn't look to be a moneymaker. Barbara struck me as being bitter. I don't know if she was that way personally, or if she was upset that Frank had left her. In any case, we believe she didn't do anything."
Al Parrish, Glenn Chisholm's colleague on the Frank Matthews case, also gives us his impressions of the interview with Barbara Hinton.
"It did not seem that Hinton had any recent contact with Matthews. What kind of man leaves his kids and doesn't show up again? Surely, if he was alive, he'd have stayed in contact with Barbara for the sake of the kids. I just didn't get it."
The Frank Matthews lead became weaker as time went on. Investigators Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, who were working on the case, were quite critical of Gerard Miller, the man that had led the Group 12 that had charged Matthews, because according to them, Miller had done a poor job of thinking he knew everything about Frank, when in fact, there was very little to go on. What's more, on examining the files, the investigators noticed that at one point, Frank Matthews had been prepared to cooperate with the authorities, on condition that he left some of his men alone. An offer Miller allegedly refused, which made no sense.
"That was stupid. We already had them on the wiretaps. On top of that, somebody spooked Matthews by telling him he was going to get life. You never say that. Matthews must have felt as if he had no choice but to run."
In any case, the investigators continued their work. which then brings us to January 28, 1974, the day Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish went to Madison Square Garden in New York to watch the second fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. The aim was to catch Frank Matthews, a die-hard Muhammad Ali fan. The two investigators had been informed that Frank had undergone cosmetic surgery to modify his features and thus go incognito. Glenn Chisholm recalls,
I was really excited. I was going to an Ali Frazier fight and catch a big fugitive too. The experience was really something for a young agent like me.
That day, at least 20,000 people attended the legendary fight. The agents arrived early to observe the crowd, tried to take photos, but nothing. Not a single sign of Frank Matthews. It was another failure. A year goes by, and the investigation group, which includes Glenn Chisholm and Al Parrish, has not made one iota of progress. It turns out that the investigators had spent an enormous amount of time looking for clues, examining the slightest piece of evidence, traveling across the United States and abroad to follow up potential leads, and in the end, had achieved very little. In the end, they knew as much about Matthews' disappearance as they did at the start, a status quo that prompted the DEA to disband the investigation group.
We felt like we had wasted our time and had gotten nowhere. The DEA didn't have its act together.
The investigation was then handed over to the U.S. Marshals, who took up the case from scratch, given the paucity of information on the fugitive. But here too, as time went on, leads became increasingly scarce. The DEA, which had kept the Matthews file open and continued the search, then saw a new generation of agents arrive in the following decades, who certainly knew Frank but had other things to worry about. This was a time when major drug traffickers in Colombia and Mexico were monopolizing all the attention of the American authorities, and the Frank Matthews case was no longer the DEA's priority. So, the U.S. Marshals took over the case and tried to locate him themselves, but it was always the same scenario. Mike Pizzi, a member of the U.S. Marshals who oversaw the investigation against Frank Matthews, recalls,
We spent countless hours pursuing and harassing everyone we thought knew Matthews or who had contact with him. Some people were hassled to the point that they found it necessary to change their locations. Others got used to seeing us on a regular basis, and they didn't like it.
A frontal strategy, but one that had its limits, as Dave O'Flaherty, also a member of the U.S. Marshals, points out.
We didn't shake up anything. We asked someone, "Did you see Frank?" They'd try to play us. They'd say, "Got some money, brother? I'll tell you." We concluded that nobody we talked to knew anything, and that Frank Matthews was no longer in New York City.
The U.S. Marshals continued to search, then took a closer look at the three sons Frank had left behind. That's when they learned that one of them was in prison for stealing cars. This was surprising, as Frank was known to be a good father. But to go from a caring father to a heartless one was strange. A suspicion shared by Mike Pizzi, who states,
If Matthews had $20 million when he left and he was still alive, what was his son doing stealing cars? I didn't feel that Frank had reached out to his family since he disappeared.
Had he deliberately cut himself off from those closest to him to ensure an effective escape? If so, it was surprising. What if, after all, Frank Matthews was dead? Of course, no fingerprints or traces of his body have been found, but there are theories that point in that direction. Many people interviewed by the investigators have said that Frank Matthews is no longer with us. Deborah Nightwine, a member of the U.S. Marshal Service, seems to share this opinion.
The Matthews investigation was the most frustrating case I ever worked. I literally worked the case 24/7. I followed through on every lead. By the end of the assignment, I began thinking that maybe the reason I didn't find anything solid was because Frank Matthews was dead.
Mike Pizzi also believes in this hypothesis.
Being the ultimate optimist, I originally believed we could find and arrest him. My deputies and I worked many cases where the investigation took us far and wide. Usually we had a piece of information or a lead that was solid, even in cases where the fugitive was now 1 month ahead of us, or a state or county away from the last sighting or the last verifiable piece of information. but I don't recall a case from the past 40 or more years that involves a fugitive fleeing with a young girlfriend and both of them disappearing without a trace.
But if Frank Matthews was dead, what happened to him? Seth Ferranti, an author who has taken an interest in Frank's life, has his own idea.
I subscribe to the theory that the mob had him whacked because he knew too much about their operations, and also because if he really had $20 million cash, as the legend says, the mob wanted that money for sure. Plus, Frank's organization was in shambles, and he was on the run from the feds. Whether arrested, indicted, or in jail, Frank didn't have the justice he once had, so it was easier for the mob to move on him. I believe that is what happened. Frank is sleeping with the fishes somewhere.
A plausible theory, in the sense that Frank didn't like the Mafia, and the Mafia didn't like him either. First of all, we know that some New York mobsters didn't like Frank coming to Toad Hill, as Gerard Miller explains.
We know the mob was really upset with Frank's presence in Todd Hill. We learned that the mob sent a delegation to see Frank and tell him he was out of his league. La Cosa Nostra, in fact, was so upset that Group 12 even started to receive anonymous intelligence from sources living across the street from the Matthews family. They were telling us about what was happening at Frank's place.
The mobster Paul Castellano even wanted to eliminate Frank, according to the police, who overheard him on a telephone tap. A death threat taken seriously by Matthews, who then tried to arrange a meeting with Big Paul. Then there was the time Frank Matthews kidnapped an associate of the Genovese family, in revenge for another of the family's associates ripping him off in a drugs deal. A totally insane act that could have led the Mafia to eliminate him too. So, Frank Matthews eliminated by the Mafia? Yes, it's quite likely. But it's also possible that he died of a cocaine overdose, since it was known that he had a strong addiction to the drug and that he had heart problems. Or we could believe this other theory of assassination, a theory involving Matthews, the CIA, the Corsicans, and Venezuela. Because at the time, Frank is said to have scuppered the Corsicans' drug trafficking network in Venezuela. The Group 12, which was investigating Frank at the time, had recovered telephone taps in which Frank was heard revealing information about this connection, which subsequently enabled the authorities to dismantle the network. This incident is said to have infuriated the Corsicans, who pointed the finger at Matthews and named him as the main culprit behind the huge loss of money. The fact that the Corsicans had to change their supply route to Miami may therefore have prompted them to want to eliminate Frank, as did the CIA, which had interests in the region.
While we have no way of knowing what the CIA thought about the Venezuelan bust, they must have been furious with Matthews as well because the agency was very active in Venezuela. So in my view, the Venezuelan bust probably screwed up, or at least interfered with their plans.
So we have the Corsican Mafia on one side and the CIA on the other, both of whom had something against Frank. Two big entities that would have had no trouble making him disappear without a trace.
I began to change my opinion about Matthews after learning about his connections to the Corsicans and the CIA, and to Rolando Gonzalez and Venezuela. Put all that together and put $10 or $20 million in cash in Matthews' hands, and I could see him headed for a hole in the ground without his money, and with Brown right next to him. Matthews was no longer an asset, and as a fugitive, he was a liability.
So, was Frank Matthews murdered? Unfortunately, we can only speculate on this possibility. These and other rumors only add to the Frank Matthews mystery. Some think he's dead, others that he's still alive and kicking, and that he's pulled off the biggest disappearance in the history of crime. What's certain is that the more the years go by, the less likely it is that we'll ever discover the truth about this story. The story of a drug lord who, overnight, disappeared from the face of the earth without a trace. What happened to Frank Matthews after his disappearance? It's a question that I fear will remain forever unanswered.
I'll tell this, his body never turned up. Cheryl Brown's body never turned up. No bones were ever located. It's very, very unusual in cold case homicide cases where a body never turns up. He's covered his path very well.
So, what do you think? Is Frank Matthews still alive? I'd be interested to hear what you think. Thanks in any case for following the video to the end. If you liked it, please feel free to like and share it. It would be a great help to me. Hope to meet you again as quickly as possible. See you soon, and take care.